The boy was digging a grave. Or so the consensus went in the valley of Alstead. From the track below, men on their way to the timber stands or the river would pause their wagons. They would watch the solitary figure of Elias Cole, all of 17 years old, as he worked against the granite face of the northern hill. He was not felling trees or laying a foundation. He was disappearing into the earth. He had inherited the small, stony plot from a grandfather he barely remembered, a strange old man who had died talking to the sky. The property came with a dilapidated shack and a shallow cave, little more than a rock overhang where shepherds might shelter their flock from a sudden rain. It was this cave that had become the boy's obsession. But he was not merely clearing it, he was driving it deeper. He worked with a mad single-mindedness, his pickaxe ringing against the stone, the sound echoing thinly across the valley. He had spent the summer hollowing out the first chamber, squaring its walls, and building a crude but sturdy wooden entrance. Now, with autumn painting the aspen trees in violent shades of yellow and orange, he had started on a second chamber, directly behind the first. This was the detail that sealed his reputation as a fool. A second room, deeper into the cold, damp stone. Silas Blackwood, a man whose hands had framed nearly every proper home in Alstead, was the first to give the project its name. He stood with his arms crossed, his own magnificent farmhouse visible on the opposite slope, a testament to sound timber and sensible design. "It is a groundhog's tomb," Blackwood declared, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. The men with him chuckled. He'll spend all his energy digging a hole only to be flooded by the spring thaw or frozen by the winter damp. The logic was unassailable. Everyone knew a house needed to stand on stone, not in it. A house needed a foundation to lift it from the wet earth, to allow air to circulate. A house needed sunlight. Elias was building a root cellar to live in, and a second one behind that for good measure. They laughed. They shook their heads, and they went about their sensible lives, confident in the wisdom of wood and stone and air and sunlight. They left the orphan boy to dig his own grave on the lonely side of the hill. Elias heard their laughter. He felt their judgment roll down the slope like loose scree. He did not stop. His shoulders ached. His hands, raw and blistered for weeks, had finally hardened into calloused leather. He just kept swinging the pickaxe. His fuel was not foolishness. It was a book. It was his grandfather's journal, a thick, leather-bound volume filled with spidery handwriting and intricate, meticulous drawings. The old man had not been mad. He had been a student of the old ways, of a knowledge that came from a land of brutal winters and scarce resources. A land where survival depended not on fighting the elements, but on understanding them. One phrase appeared over and over in the margins, a mantra written in a slightly different script. Terra memoriam retinet calorum. The earth remembers warmth. The drawings showed cross-sections of hillsides. They detailed structures built not on the land, but within it. The designs were all variations on a single, powerful theme. 2 chambers. Always 2 chambers. The first was the atrium frigidum, the cold hall. It was a trap, an airlock. It was designed to catch the winter wind, to hold the snow, to absorb the initial brutal shock of the cold. It was a sacrifice. The second, deeper chamber was the cubiculum calidum, the warm room. This was the heart. Dug deep enough, it was insulated by the immense thermal mass of the earth itself. The planet's core bled a constant, gentle heat outwards. Below the frost line, the ground maintained a steady temperature, a cool cellar in the summer, a mild haven in the winter. The earth remembers warmth. The genius was in the connection. A low, narrow passage between the 2 chambers, sealed by a heavy, insulated door, and a ventilation system so simple it was nearly invisible. A small intake shaft near the floor, drawing air from the cold outer chamber, and an exhaust shaft high on the back wall, angled up through 20 feet of solid rock to the surface. The small stove he planned to install would do more than heat the air. It would create a current, a gentle, continuous loop. Cold, dense air would be drawn in, heated by the stove and the surrounding rock, and then rise, venting stale air out the chimney shaft. The stone walls, warmed by this constant low-grade heat, would become a thermal battery, radiating warmth long after the fire had died to embers. It was a living, breathing system, a lung made of rock and air, so Elias dug. He was not digging a grave, he was building a lung. He worked from dawn until his muscles screamed and the light failed. He hauled out bucket after bucket of rock and soil, his wheelbarrow carving a deep rut in the path from the cave mouth. He learned the language of the stone, the sharp crack of granite giving way, the dull thud of the pick against a pocket of clay, the treacherous slide of shale. One afternoon, as he sat eating a stale biscuit, a shadow fell over him. It was a dog, a shepherd mix with ribs like a washboard and wary, intelligent eyes. It kept its distance, watching him, its head cocked. Elias broke his biscuit in half and tossed a piece. The dog snatched it from the air and vanished back into the woods. The next day, it was back, sitting a few feet closer. Elias shared his lunch again. This continued for a week, a silent ritual of shared hardship. Then one evening, as the first true chill of autumn descended, Elias woke to a low growl. The dog was standing at the entrance of the outer cave, the fur on its neck raised. Down on the track, a pair of coyotes slunk by. The dog had appointed itself guardian. Elias moved his bedroll deeper into the cave. The dog, which he now called Fen, curled up at his feet. He was no longer entirely alone. His progress was slow but steady. By the time the last of the aspen leaves had fallen, the inner chamber was complete. It was a small space, no more than 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. He had smoothed the walls as best he could and laid a floor of flat stones over a bed of dry sand. He built the heavy door for the passage, layering cured hides stuffed with moss between 2 thick slabs of pine. It hung on massive iron hinges he had traded a week's labor for at the blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith's daughter, Lena, had brought them to his site. She was a quiet girl with kind eyes who did not laugh. She watched him work for a moment, her gaze taking in the strange, 2-room design. "My father says you work harder than any man in this valley," she said. It was not a compliment. It was a simple statement of fact. "The work needs doing," Elias replied, his voice rough from disuse. "They say you're digging a tomb," she said softly, testing the word. For the first time, Elias felt a need to explain. He did not use the Latin phrases from the journal. He used simpler words. "The first room is for the cold," he said, pointing. "The second room is for me. The earth will keep it warm." Lena looked from the dark cave mouth to the vast, cold sky. She did not understand the principles, but she understood the certainty in his voice. She nodded, handed him a small sack of fresh-baked bread her mother had sent, and left without another word. It was the first act of unsolicited kindness he had received since arriving in Alstead. The visit from Silas Blackwood was not so kind. He did not come alone. He arrived with the town reeve and the deacon, a trinity of local authority. They stood before the cave, their shadows long in the late afternoon sun. Fen let out a low, guttural growl, and Elias placed a calming hand on his head. Blackwood inspected the entrance, his lip curled in disdain. He peered into the dark of the first chamber. He did not deign to go inside. "Boy," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have come for your own good. Winter is not a game here. This creation of yours is a death trap." He launched into a lecture. He spoke of frost heave, how the freezing and thawing of the ground would crack the very rock around him. He spoke of condensation, how the moisture from his own breath would turn the walls to sheets of ice. He spoke of the snow load, explaining that without a pitched roof, the accumulating drifts would seal his entrance, burying him alive. I have built 30 homes in this valley, Blackwood said, jabbing a thick finger in Elias's direction. Homes that stand, homes that keep families warm and safe. I know the grain of the wood and the nature of the stone, and I am telling you, this hole will kill you. The deacon spoke next, his voice softer, but no less damning. He spoke of pride, of a young man's folly in thinking he knew better than his elders. He spoke of community, and how Elias's stubborn isolation was an affront to their way of life. Elias listened patiently. He let the words wash over him. They were the words of men who saw only the surface of things. They did not understand the deep, slow truths written in his grandfather's book. When they were finished, he said only one thing. I thank you for your concern, but my home is sound. Blackwood's face hardened. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had expected a contrite boy, easily cowed by authority. He shifted his tactics. This land is worthless, he said, gesturing at the rocky slope. Nothing but granite and scrub pine. It is of no use to a farmer. It is of no use to a builder. But my property borders it. For the sake of tidiness, I will take it off your hands. He made an offer. It was a low price, but to a boy they assumed was destitute, it should have sounded like a fortune. Take the money, Blackwood urged. Come work for me. I will teach you a proper trade. You can earn your keep and live in a proper house. It was a test and a threat, an offer of salvation that was also a final dismissive judgment on everything Elias had worked for. I am not for sale, Elias said, and neither is my home. The three men stared at him, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief. They saw a boy blinded by a foolish, inherited pride. They could not see the quiet confidence that came from a deeper knowledge. They saw an orphan digging a hole. They could not see the architect of a new kind of survival. They left, their boots crunching angrily on the gravel path. So be it, Blackwood called back over his shoulder. Do not come crying to us when the ice sets in your lungs. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. November arrived with a bitter, scouring wind. A cold snap descended from the north, locking the river in thin sheets of ice and killing the last of the autumn crops. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees for a week straight. In the valley, the sounds of axes were constant as men worked their wood piles, feeding their hungry stoves day and night. Smoke poured from every chimney, a gray tribute to the cold. Inside the timber-framed houses, families huddled close to their hearths, their backs chilled by the drafts that snaked through every chink in the walls. On the hill, Elias lit a small fire in his new stove. He used only a few pieces of seasoned oak. The inner chamber, the cubiculum calidum, began to warm. The stone walls, cool to the touch, slowly drank in the heat. Within an hour, the temperature had risen to a comfortable 65 degrees. The convective loop began its slow, invisible dance. He banked the fire before he slept. When he woke in the morning, the air was still warm. The stones were radiating a gentle, persistent heat. The earth was remembering. He consumed less than a quarter of the wood that a family in a conventional cabin would burn, just to keep from freezing. He was warm. He was comfortable. Fenn snoozed contentedly on a bearskin rug, untroubled by the cold that held the rest of the valley in its grip. Word of this trickled down the hill. A hunter, passing by, saw no smoke from Elias's chimney, and, fearing the worst, had climbed up to check on him. He found the boy in his shirt-sleeves, calmly mending a harness in the warm, dry cavern. The hunter told the story at the general store. The men listened, intrigued for a moment, before Silas Blackwood offered his expert analysis. "It is a fluke of the weather," he announced. "A shallow cold. The ground has not yet frozen deep. He is living on borrowed time from the summer's warmth. Wait for the real winter. Wait for the deep freeze. That hole will become a block of ice, and him with it." The men nodded. Blackwood's logic was always so reassuring. It confirmed what they already believed. The boy was a fool, and his luck would soon run out. Only one man disagreed. Old Man Hemlock, A trapper whose memory stretched back further than anyone's sat by the cold stove, his joints aching. He had been watching the sky. He had been watching the animals. "The squirrels are hoarding green nuts," he rasped, his voice thin and dry as a corn husk. "The bark on the north side of the oaks is thicker than I've ever seen it. And the geese? They flew south a month early, in a silent V, no honking. Just running." He looked at the faces around him, faces of men who trusted sawmills and timber frames. "You are all busy watching the boy in the hill. You should be watching the sky. It's holding its breath. A white death is coming. A storm that will make the blizzard of '78 look like a spring shower. A storm to bury houses. A storm to break the proud." They smiled at him, the fond, dismissive smiles they reserved for the very old. They bought him a hot cider and went back to talking about lumber prices and the boy's foolishness. The storm arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. It did not come with a warning of gentle flakes. It came like an explosion. The sky, which had been a flat metallic gray for days, turned a bruised purple. The wind began to moan, a low, keening sound that vibrated in the bones. Then the world outside the valley of Alstead simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by a churning horizontal chaos of white. The snow was not falling, it was being driven. It was as fine as sand and as hard as glass, and it moved with the force of a river. The wind came down that valley like a freight train, a solid, unstoppable force that screamed and clawed at every structure built by man. The temperature plummeted. It dropped 20 degrees in the first hour, then 30, then 50. By nightfall, the mercury in the town deacon's official thermometer had frozen solid at 42 degrees below zero. Inside his inner chamber, Elias felt the change. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the rock around him, the sound of the world being torn apart. He had sealed the outer door with packed sod, and the inner door was latched tight. The outer chamber, the cold hall, was doing its job. It was being violated by the storm, filled with a massive, swirling drift of snow that pushed through every crack. It was sacrificing itself, becoming a part of the winter, an insulating barrier of frozen air and packed snow. The small stove glowed with a cherry-red heat. The air drawn into the room through the low vent was pre-chilled to an extreme degree, but the stove and the warm rock tamed it instantly. The temperature inside the cubiculum calidum held steady. He checked the thermometer his grandfather had left him. 79 degrees. He sat on his cot, the journal open on his lap. Fen lay beside him, his head on Elias's knee, utterly calm. The dog felt the deep peace of the stone, the unshakable stability of the earth. Outside, the apocalypse raged. Inside, there was only the quiet crackle of the fire and the gentle, radiant warmth of the rock. The earth remembers warmth. For Silas Blackwood, the earth offered no such comfort. His house, the pride of the valley, was under siege. The wind hit the northern wall with the force of a battering ram. The timbers, felled and squared by his own expert hand, groaned in protest. A fine, needle-like snow forced its way through the window frames, coating the inside of the glass with a layer of frost, then a sheet of ice. His wife and 2 young sons were huddled by the massive stone fireplace, which was consuming logs at a terrifying rate, yet its heat barely reached 10 feet into the room. The rest of the house was arctic. Around midnight they heard the first crack. It was sharp, loud as a rifle shot, and it came from above. Blackwood grabbed a lantern and went to the attic. The sight that met him turned his blood to ice. The snow was not sliding off his perfectly pitched roof. The wind was so strong it was packing the snow against the northern slope of the roof, plastering it there, creating a drift of unimaginable weight. A massive ridge beam, a piece of old-growth oak 12 inches square, was bowing downwards. As he watched, splinters of wood rained down. He knew with the cold certainty of a master builder that the house was lost. The spine of the structure was breaking. "Get to the cellar," he roared to his family. They had barely scrambled down the ladder when the roof gave way. It did not collapse in one clean motion. It tore apart with a sound of tortured, screaming wood. The ridge beam snapped, and a section of the roof 20 feet long simply vanished, sucked away into the storm. Snow poured in like water through a broken dam, a sudden silent avalanche that filled the upper floor in seconds. His house, his monument to conventional wisdom, was a ruin. The cellar offered protection from the wind, but not from the cold. Within an hour, their breath was fogging, and the deep, killing chill was setting in. Blackwood knew they would not survive until morning. There was only one place, a single insane possibility: the groundhog's tomb. He made the decision. It was not a choice between pride and humility. It was a choice between life and death. He wrapped his wife and sons in every blanket they could find and pushed open the cellar's outer door. The storm hit him like a physical blow. He could not see. He could not breathe. He navigated by memory, by the feel of the land beneath his feet. The 100-yard journey to the boys' homestead was a trek across a polar wasteland. His son, a boy of 8, stumbled and fell. Blackwood threw the boy over his shoulder and pressed on, the child shivering a frantic, desperate rhythm against his back. He almost missed it. The entrance to the cave was nearly obliterated by a mountain of drifted snow, but he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible glow filtering up from the hidden ventilation shaft. A ghost of warmth rising into the frozen hellscape. He clawed at the snow and sod sealing the outer door. His fingers were numb, useless clubs. He hammered on the thick planks with his fists, his shout swallowed by the roar of the wind. "Elias! In the name of God, help us!" Inside, Elias heard it, a faint, rhythmic thudding that was not the storm. Fen heard it too and stood, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. He unlatched the heavy inner door and moved into the frigid darkness of the outer chamber. The sound was louder here. He pulled away the sod and wrenched the outer door open. Silas Blackwood fell inside, a creature of ice and desperation. His wife and children stumbled in after him. They were covered in snow, their faces masks of frost, their eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Elias said nothing. There was no "I told you so." There was no hesitation. There was only the quiet, immediate response to human need. He helped them to their feet, sealed the outer door against the storm, and led them through the low passage into the warmth. The transition was breathtaking. One moment they were in a frozen anteroom that was little better than the blizzard outside. The next, they were enveloped in a wave of dry, radiant heat. The air was warm and still. The light from the stove and a single lantern was soft and steady. Blackwood's wife began to weep, deep, shuddering sobs of relief. The children, their faces already beginning to thaw, stared at the smooth rock walls as if they were in a cathedral. Blackwood himself could not speak. He stood dripping melted snow onto the stone floor and looked around. He saw the ingenious design he had mocked, the dry floor, the lack of condensation, the impossible, life-giving warmth. He looked at the boy he had called a fool, a boy who was now calmly ladling hot broth into bowls for his children. "How?" Blackwood finally whispered, his voice cracking. "There is no damp, there is no ice. It should be a frozen tomb." Elias picked up the journal from his cot. He opened it to a cross-section drawing of the 2 chambers and the ventilation shafts. He pointed to the lines showing the flow of air. He pointed to the deep rock surrounding them. "The first room is for the storm," he explained, his voice even. "It holds the cold. The inner room is for living. The stove creates a current, but the real heat, it comes from the stone. The earth is very deep, and it never truly gets cold. It remembers the warmth of all the summers that have ever been." Over the course of the next day, more refugees arrived. The storm did not abate. It raged on, a relentless siege. But somehow, guided by desperation and the faintest memory of the boys' strange project, survivors found their way. Lena and her family came, their own roof having buckled, then the hunter who had first checked on Elias, then 3 more families from the lower valley whose homes had been crushed. The small chamber, built for 1, became a sanctuary for 17. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a huddled mass of shared humanity, listening to the storm howl far above them. They shared Elias's meager rations, and they all drank in the impossible life-saving warmth. They were alive because a boy had listened to the wisdom of his grandfather. They were alive because the earth remembers warmth. When the storm finally broke after 3 days, the world was remade. It was a world of profound silence, buried under 15 feet of snow. The valley of Alstead was a graveyard of broken homes. Dozens had perished. The survivors emerged from the cavern into the blinding white light. Silas Blackwood was the last one out. He stood before the small group, his face gaunt, his pride stripped away. He looked at the ruins of his own grand house, a monument to his own arrogance. Then he looked at the simple, snow-covered entrance to Elias's home. He turned to the others. His voice, when he spoke, was heavy with the weight of his conversion. "I called this boy a fool," he said, his words sharp in the frozen air. "I mocked him. I told him he was digging his own grave." He paused, and his gaze met Elias's. "I was the fool. We were all fools. We trusted our eyes, and he trusted a knowledge that was older and deeper. This boy and his grandfather's book, they did not dig a grave. They built an ark, and they saved us." He took a step toward Elias. He did not offer a handshake. He inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect, the deference of a student to a master. "Teach us," he said. "Teach us how to rebuild." And so he did. Blackwood, the master builder, became Elias's first and most devoted apprentice. Together they salvaged what they could from the ruins, and they began to build again, but they did not build the same way. They built into the hillsides, they dug 2 chambers, they engineered the ventilation shafts and the heavy insulated doors. The hearthstone method, they called it. The settlement of Alstead was reborn, not as a collection of vulnerable wooden boxes on the landscape, but as a community of homes nestled within it. The new homes were warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. They consumed a fraction of the firewood. They were quiet and safe, and they stood as a testament to the terrible lesson the White Death had taught them. Decades passed, the world changed, but in the valley of Alstead, the wisdom held. Elias Cole married Lena, the blacksmith's daughter with the kind eyes. They raised 4 children in the original cavern, which they expanded over the years, adding new chambers, a workshop, and a cold storage room for food. He never sought praise or position. He remained a quiet, thoughtful man, his hands always busy, his mind always listening to the slow, deep rhythms of the earth. He became the respected elder of the community, the man they turned to when their own wisdom failed. They called him the Earth Listener. He taught his children and his grandchildren the principles from his grandfather's journal, ensuring the knowledge would not be forgotten again. He lived to be 87 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the warm, silent dark of the inner chamber he had carved from the stone with his own 2 hands as a boy. Modern engineers would later give names to the principles he had used. They would call it passive geothermal exchange and earth-sheltered construction. They would write complex formulas to describe the thermal flywheel effect of the rock mass. They would prove, with scientific instruments and detailed studies, that his grandfather's ancient wisdom was, in fact, a perfect and efficient science. But the people of Alstead knew it by a simpler name. They knew it as Elias's Way. His grandson, a stonemason, carved his epitaph on a large flat granite stone placed at the entrance to the home. It did not list the dates of his birth or death. It bore only a single, simple sentence that captured the entirety of his legacy. Elias Cole. He listened to the earth, and it gave him warmth.